shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Seconds into the countdown. 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Few people knew how close disaster already was. The night before Challenger launched, engineers urgently begged NASA to delay the mission, warning that the unusually cold weather could cause serious problems. But their concerns were ignored. One engineer even went home and told his wife, "It's going to blow up." The next morning, millions of people watched live as 7 astronauts lost their lives, even though NASA had known about critical technical problems as far back as 1977, and chose to keep flying anyway. This wasn't a shocking accident. It was a preventable disaster. After the Apollo missions, NASA dreamed of a reusable space shuttle that could make spaceflight cheaper and routine, announcing the program in 1972 as a kind of space truck meant to carry astronauts and satellites and help build a future space station. That dream seemed to come true on April 12, 1981, when the first shuttle, Columbia, successfully launched and returned, proving reuse was possible. By 1982, the shuttle was flying regular missions, launching satellites, conducting experiments, and breaking social barriers as Sally Ride became the first American woman in space and Guyon Bluford the first African-American astronaut. Early success fueled confidence, and NASA promised Congress up to 24 flights a year, even though the shuttle hadn't been tested for that pace. By 1985, the pressure to maintain momentum was intense, with 9 launches in a single year, non-stop maintenance, and frequent last-minute issues that were often brushed aside to meet deadlines. To keep public excitement high, NASA introduced a Teacher in Space program, selecting Krista McAuliffe from over 11,000 applicants, and her story captivated the nation. Behind the scenes, however, engineers grew increasingly uneasy as unresolved technical issues piled up and risky behavior became normalized simply because past missions had survived. The most dangerous flaw lay in the solid rocket boosters, sealed by rubber O-rings that were supposed to expand under heat, yet early tests showed they often failed to seal properly. By 1984 and 1985, soot marks, erosion, and even damage to backup O-rings were appearing on nearly every flight, especially in cold conditions. Engineers from Moreton Thiokol, including Roger Boisjoli and Alan MacDonald, repeatedly warned that the design was unsafe and pushed for fixes, even predicting loss of life if nothing changed, but their warnings were largely dismissed. Past success created a false sense of security. Communication between engineers and managers broke down, and risk was quietly accepted. As 1985 ended, NASA prepared for Challenger mission STS-51L, a highly publicized flight carrying 7 crew members, including Krista McAuliffe, with plans to deploy a $100 million satellite and observe Halley's Comet, setting the stage for one of the most tragic moments in space history. It was the program's 25th mission and Challenger's 10th flight, originally scheduled for January 22, 1986, but almost nothing went as planned. Delays from the previous shuttle mission, bad weather, and technical glitches kept pushing the launch back, forcing the crew to suit up multiple times only to be sent home again. By the time the launch was rescheduled for January 28, it was already the 7th attempt, and while the astronauts handled the frustration with patience and public smiles, none of them knew how deeply worried some engineers were. The night before launch, an unusual cold settled over Florida, freezing the air around Kennedy Space Center and coating the launch pad in ice, with temperatures expected to drop to around 30 degrees Fahrenheit, colder than any previous shuttle launch. Engineers at Moreton Thiokol immediately feared for the rubber O-rings, knowing cold could make them stiff and unable to seal properly, a failure that could destroy the shuttle. Roger Boisjoli, Bob Ebeling, and others urgently warned management, recalling that O-rings had already struggled at much warmer temperatures. A late-night teleconference followed, where engineers presented charts and pleaded for delay, believing embarrassment was better than risking lives. But NASA managers, worn down by repeated postponements and mounting pressure, pushed back, arguing the evidence was insufficient since previous flights had survived O-ring erosion. Caught between NASA and their own engineers, Thiokol's executives asked their team to think like managers, and under pressure, they reversed their recommendation and approved the launch, leaving the engineers devastated. One later telling his wife, "It's going to blow up." Morning came and the cold remained, ice still clinging to metal structures, but NASA decided it wasn't dangerous enough to stop the countdown. At 11:30 a.m., the crew climbed aboard, unaware of the overnight arguments, smiling for cameras as crowds gathered and millions of children across the country, including Krista McAuliffe students, watched from classrooms. At 11:38 a.m., Challenger lifted off, appearing flawless from the ground, though small puffs of gray smoke leaked from the right booster almost immediately as the O-ring failed to seal. The shuttle climbed past maximum air pressure, received the call to throttle up, and Commander Dick Scobie calmly replied, "Roger, go at throttle up," the final word from Challenger. 73 seconds after liftoff, a bright flash ripped through the sky as hot gas from the failed O-ring ignited, burned through the external fuel tank, and caused the shuttle to tear apart at nearly twice the speed of sound. What looked like an explosion on television was a violent breakup of the vehicle and igniting fuel, while the still-firing booster spun out of control until destroyed by ground controllers. In mission control, stunned silence fell before the words came over the radio that the vehicle had exploded, emergency procedures began, and the reality set in that there was nothing anyone could do. Data servers were sealed, and rescue teams were dispatched to search the Atlantic Ocean about 20 miles off the Florida coast where Challenger's debris was raining down. But the most heartbreaking question centered on the crew. The crew cabin had broken free from the rest of the shuttle and continued traveling upward, never burning up, reaching an altitude of nearly 65,000 feet before falling back toward Earth. Built to be extremely strong, the cabin remained mostly intact, though the astronauts inside were violently thrown around, and later evidence showed that at least some of them were alive after the breakup. 3 emergency air packs had been manually activated, pilot Mike Smith's and 2 others, while Commander Dick Scobie's had not, and investigators also found cockpit switches moved from their launch positions, suggesting Smith may have been trying to regain control in the final moments. Inside the powerless cabin, air pressure was dropping rapidly, likely causing the crew to lose consciousness before impact. When the cabin struck the ocean at over 200 miles per hour, the force was catastrophic and unsurvivable. NASA later admitted they could not determine the exact moment the crew died, stating that while the breakup forces were survivable, the final impact was not, a painful truth the agency rarely discussed publicly. Across the nation, shock and grief spread as what was meant to be a proud celebration. The first teacher in space became a tragedy witnessed live by millions, including school children sitting in classrooms. Families at Kennedy Space Center wept as debris scattered into the sea, mission control fell into stunned silence, and every major television network replayed the moment again and again. It was the first fatal accident of an American spacecraft during flight, and it unfolded before the entire world. That afternoon, NASA grounded all shuttle missions, and President Ronald Reagan canceled his planned speech to Congress, instead addressing the nation from the Oval Office to comfort grieving families and children while honoring the crew's courage, ending with a poem about touching the face of God. 3 days later, a memorial service was held at Johnson Space Center in Houston under cold gray skies, as military jets flew overhead in a missing man formation, and Reagan spoke of the pain and perseverance required to keep reaching for the stars. In the aftermath, the nation demanded answers, prompting Reagan to form the Rogers Commission, led by former Secretary of State William P. Rogers, and including figures such as Neil Armstrong, Chuck Yeager, Sally Ride, and physicist Richard Feynman. Distrustful of NASA investigating itself, the commission took full control, interviewing more than 160 people and dividing into teams to examine technical failures, management decisions, and schedule pressure. One of the most powerful moments came when Feynman demonstrated how cold made the shuttle's rubber O-rings brittle by immersing one in ice water during a televised hearing, visually proving the cause of the disaster. His blunt approach ensured the truth was not softened, and he later wrote a scathing section of the final report accusing NASA of ignoring warnings and placing blind faith in a flawed system. The commission ultimately concluded that hot gases leaking past the cold-stiffened O-rings caused a breakup, but it also revealed deeper failures. NASA had known about O-ring issues since 1977, accepted the risk without fully understanding it, and ignored urgent warnings the night before launch. Engineers' concerns never reached top leadership, as middle managers under schedule pressure made the final decision. And while rumors suggested White House interference, investigators found no evidence of political pressure, determining instead that the fatal push to launch came from within NASA itself, driven by promises made and a desperate need to stay on schedule. When the Rogers Commission released its final report in June 1986, it didn't just blame the failed O-rings. It blamed the entire system that allowed the disaster to happen. The Commission issued 9 major recommendations. starting with a complete redesign of the shuttle's joints to prevent such a failure from ever happening again. But it also demanded a fundamental change in how NASA managed the program. Engineers' concerns were to be heard at the highest levels. A new independent safety office was to report directly to the NASA administrator, and astronauts were to be included in key decisions since their lives were on the line. The truth was painfully clear. On the night of January 27, 1986, Martin Fire Coal engineers explicitly warned about the extreme cold and the danger it posed, and if NASA management had listened, Challenger would not have launched the next morning. The mission could have been delayed until warmer weather returned. The O-rings would have remained flexible, the shuttle would have completed its flight, and Krista McAuliffe would have come home to her students, perhaps becoming a national voice for space education. NASA might have endured a few jokes about delays, but disaster would have been avoided and the O-ring flaw quietly fixed. Instead, the culture inside NASA was driven by one overriding goal: launch on schedule, and when deadlines are placed above safety, mistakes become tragedies. Challenger was lost not because the risks were unknown, but because those who understood them were ignored. Questions have lingered about political pressure as well, with speculation that NASA felt compelled to stay on schedule as President Reagan prepared for his State of the Union address, though no evidence of a direct order was ever found. Still, even the perception of political pressure can influence decisions, especially after repeated delays. Deeper concerns also emerged about business and organizational incentives, as Martin Fire Coal's booster design was costly to fix and speaking up about flaws risked contracts, careers, and trust. The investigation found no proof of corruption, but it revealed a culture where bad news was quietly discouraged, allowing known problems to persist until it was too late. Challenger ultimately became the price of that mindset. And yet, had the O-rings held that morning, the mission would have been hailed as a success, the teacher in space program would have continued, more civilians would have flown, and NASA's packed launch schedule would have rolled on, while the dangerous flaw remained hidden. Another shuttle might have been lost later, perhaps under even higher stakes. Challenger's tragedy forced the truth into the open, and without it, the danger might have remained invisible until it claimed even more lives.